Good afternoon. I'll be talking to you about literary elements in children's literature. In this session, we will discuss genres and subgenres that fall under their umbrella. I'll also give you some sample readings for some of the subgenres as well as activities or ideas to assess student knowledge. First, we'll begin with a warm up or icebreaker to get you moving and discussing amongst each other so we can get a little more comfortable. This game is called Genres Human Bingo. It can be used as a pretest or a review. To play, each student will need a copy of the bingo board and a pencil that you all have. Clipboards are helpful but are not necessary. Each person's goal is to fill every square on their board with the signature of another student who can answer the square's question. No student can sign another person's board more than once. So if you look at the first square, you will see can tell you one trait about historical fiction. So you would find one person who can answer that question by telling you one trait about historical fiction. They would sign, and you go to the next person. No one can sign it more than once. Awesome. Let's move on. First, we want to start off with why should we know about genres or what is a genre? A genre is a style or a category of literature that has a common set of characteristics. There are a few reasons why it's important to understand the concept and know the different genres. First, it helps with organizing discussions in children's literature, which can tap into their critical thinking skills. It clarifies the ways literary elements such as character, setting, and theme function differently in different genres. Knowing different genres can help readers understand how these elements function. And last, it helps young readers. Knowledge of different genres will create a broad and rich environment where students sample different genres. Students who are exposed to different genres tend to be more confident and competent readers. As stated earlier in this session, we're going to discuss genres. We're going to talk about five main genres and the subgenres that go along with them or fall under their umbrella. Those genres are fiction, nonfiction, fantasy, traditional tales, and rhyme to poetry. First, we're going to talk about fiction. Fiction is created from the imagination and not presented as a fact, but some of it may be based off of a true story or situation that can actually happen. The subgenres of fiction are realism. Realism is based on the possible, though it's not necessarily probable. This genre can be contemporary or historical. Next, there's animal fiction, which is a literary work in which animals and their relationships to humans are important and realistic. These are also considered light fantasy. Mysteries also falls under this genre, and it includes detective stories and novels about crime, suspense, and espionage. It also includes ghost stories, thrillers, and gothic novels. Coming of age, this is a story where the writer has to be creative in making us believe that making a believable character that's aware of self and can learn from themselves and grow throughout their story. There are also family stories, romantic stories where it's semi realistic, with the central aspect of the story being a romantic relationship between a couple. So, something like Twilight. There's also historical realism or historical fiction and contemporary fiction. Contemporary fiction includes any work of fiction that takes place in modern times. Unlike modern fantasy, which exists outside of reality, contemporary fiction is grounded in the possibilities of reality. So, in this book, particular book, Spaghetti and a Hot Dog Bun, Having the Courage to Be Who You Are, it's about a young girl named Lucy who decides to help Ralph um, when he's in trouble, even though he teases her about being different. So, this is something that could actually happen in real life. There's also historical fiction. Historical fiction stories are written to portray a time period or convey information about a specific time period or an historical event. Setting is the most important literary element in this genre. In A Sweet Smell of Roses is about two young girls who participate in the freedom marches and listen to Dr. King speak. So it's not necessarily factual information, but it's talking about a specific time. So that's it for fiction. Now we're going to move on to nonfiction. Nonfiction it emphasizes on documented facts. It's to inform and entertain young readers about excellence of by the excellence of presentation, illustration, and research. It can be written about any aspect of physical, biological, or social world. Under nonfiction falls biography and informational text. With biography, this is a story that's usually about a person's life, a notable person's life, and it tells about their accomplishments or significant triumph. Usually, there are of two primary types of biographies. They're authentic, which means it's every aspect or every detail is true and is well documented. It's carefully researched accounts of subject's life. Um, these types of biographies are usually better for adults. And then there's fictionalized biographies, which must be factual records and inventions must be believable for their era. However, certain events include invented dialogue and unspoken thoughts. So they're based off of journals and diaries. In Stealing Home, Jackie Robinson Against the Odds, it's just a brief story about the baseball player Jackie Robinson. He was the first African American to play in Major League Baseball, and it includes references. Also, under this umbrella would be informational text. Informational text emphasize on documented facts. But the key thing to informational text that's different from biographies, even though they both emphasize on documented facts, informational texts are primarily written to give you information about natural and social world, and they contain certain text features to capture the purpose, like graphic elements. Maybe they have diagrams or photographs that are labeled. You'll have text features like comparing and contrasting objects or cause and effect, and they also have headings and an index. This particular book is The Umbrella. It's an informational text that gives young readers a glimpse in the life of the rainforest in Costa Rica, and it's describing the different animals. So, now that we've talked about fiction and nonfiction, let's move on to fantasy. Fantasy are stories about non existent or unreal. They're non existent or unreal, and they depend on magic or supernatural powers. Under fantasy, you have high fantasy, which is a type of fantasy that is characterized by the conflict between good and evil. It's closely patterned with folklore like mythologies and quest tales. You have fantastic stories that are realistic in most details, but still require us willingly to suspend our disbelief, like Tuck Everlasting. And some are about characters that are not people, but talk or live in houses like we do, have feelings like we do, or lead similar lives like a human would. And lastly is science fiction, which is imaginative. So let's look at high fantasy. With high fantasy is usually a difference between good or evil. Um, Many of the stories are closely related to folk tales, and there's sometimes a courageous hero. I chose Cloud with a Chance of Meatballs. This is fantasy at its best. It's about a tiny town called Choose and Swallow. And it's just like any other town except it rains food. So we know that it's something that just can't possibly happen, but we wanted to because it's cool. And lastly, science fiction. These are stories about possible future worlds that rely on the invention or extension of nature's laws, but not on magic. So, unlike other fantasies, other genres in this inside of the fantasy genre, it does not depend on magical powers because it's something that could actually happen. That the author is trying to convince us that it's something that could really happen because it is grounded off of scientific principles or technical possibilities. So this particular story, Earth to Clump, is about a young boy who has the assignment of having a pen pal, an alien named Clunk. So he decides to send Clunk all the things that he doesn't want, including his sister, because he thinks that the assignment is just out of this world, which it really is. Clunk sends him a Zoid, which he finds companionship in. The next big genre that we will talk about is traditional tales. Traditional tales or folk literature are stories that are told by ordinary people orally and not written until someone finds records and publishes the stories or rhymes. Under traditional tales fall myths, story originating in folk beliefs, showing how the world works. Can include supernatural forces cooperating with animals and humans. You have legend or hero tales, which are traditional narratives of people, often with some basis in historical truth. Folk epics, long narrative poems passed down by word of mouth, often about a hero, and then you have fables and folk tales. A folk tale is a story passed down by word of mouth. It includes fairy tales like Cinderella, Noodlehead tales, Talking Beast tales, and Tall tales. Where the Mountain Meets the Moon is about a girl from this poor village who buys a magical goldfish, and she decides to join the dragon who can't fly on a quest to find the old man of the moon in hopes of bringing fruitfulness to the mountain and freshness to the Jade River. You also have fables. Fables are brief stories, usually with animal characters, and they have a moral at the end. Aesop's fables are the go to fables. They include the lion and the mouse, the tortoise and the hare. They all have morals to them. This particular book, Aesop's Fables, this one gives a multicultural spin on the classic Aesop fables. And lastly, rhyme to poetry. Rhyme is just a repetition of identical or similar stressed sounds. Poetry is an imaginative awareness of experience expressed through meaning, sound, and rhythmic language. choices so as to evoke an emotional response. Under this genre, there's quite a bit. There's verse, which is rhyming metrical structure with less emotional intensity, ballad or folk ballad. Um, a ballad is a verse narrative of love, courage, or the supernatural. It may also be of folk origin. Lyric and personal poetry is a song like poetry with a compact expression of feeling. And then there's special poetry forms. It's usually unrhymed, so the rhythm is less important than the concept that they're trying to portray. And nursery rhymes and narrative poetry. Narrative poetry is poetry that tells a story. All the World is a book that follows a group of family members and friends through the course of a day as they learn the importance of all the great and small, all things great and small. And then nursery rhymes are brief stories that have been passed orally from generation to generation that are told in brief rhyming verse. It's sometimes considered the simplest introduction to poetry. Truckery rhymes are just truck themed Mother Goose rhymes. And that concludes my presentation. We will now play a game of